My name is Alexis Monroe. I am 29. And on New Year's Day, I learned exactly where I stand in my own family. I walked into my parents' living room that morning carrying a bag of specialty coffee from Seattle and a box of pastries I had picked up on the way. The house smelled like cinnamon and roast beans. Wrapping paper was everywhere, and everyone was laughing. My mom was holding up a new kitchen gadget. My dad was talking about some fancy grill. My sister was already taking pictures of her new spa set, and my little niece was tearing into a science toy. My name never came up. I sat down on the edge of the couch and waited. 5 minutes, 10, 15. No one handed me anything. No one even asked if I had gotten something already. It was like I was background noise in a movie about their perfect lives. Finally, I said, as casually as I could, "So did I miss my name? Or—" My mom turned to me with this tired, annoyed look I know too well and said, "Why would we spend money on you anymore? You walked away from what matters to this family. You do your own thing now. You are basically a guest out of habit." My sister let out a little laugh and added, "At least now you finally get it. You are not really on our level these days." I did not cry. I did not scream. I stood up, set the coffee on the table, told them they would need it more than I would, and walked out into the cold January air. By the time the sun went down on January 1st, I was back in my apartment in Seattle, staring at the financial app I built that tracks every dollar flowing through their coffee shops. The day ended like that. And at 8:30 the next morning, January 2nd, a single box showed up on my parents' front porch and blew their perfect little world apart. If you want to know what was inside that box, and how the daughter they treated like she did not exist ended up holding all the power, stay with me until the end. 5 years earlier, I was 24, broke by most people's standards, but somehow the only person in my family who knew how close we were to losing everything. Back then, Monroe Roasters, the little coffee chain my grandparents started in Portland, was bleeding out. My mom, Caroline, ran the day-to-day like she always had. My dad, Dennis, kept signing off on new equipment loans we could not afford, and everyone kept talking about how loyal the regulars were, as if good vibes could pay overdue invoices. My older sister, Brianna, was the golden child who posted latte art on Instagram and called herself the face of the brand. I was the one who moved to Seattle to write code, allegedly the child who walked away. I still remember the night I opened their books for the first time. I was sitting at my kitchen table in Seattle with a cheap takeout dinner, staring at a spreadsheet that made my stomach drop. Rent was behind on one location, supplier payments were being juggled, and the only plan my parents had was hoping next month would be better. I had just signed a decent contract as a software engineer for a fintech startup. It was the first time in my life I had real money in my account. And instead of celebrating, I drove 3 hours down I-5 to have an uncomfortable conversation with my parents about numbers they did not want to see. That was the night I became the majority owner of Monroe Roasters. We sat around the dining table, the same one my grandparents had bought decades ago, and I laid it out as calmly as I could. I would put up my savings to pay off the worst of the debt. In exchange, they would transfer me most of the shares. I would build a new point of sale system, wire every register in every shop into a single cloud dashboard, and track every dollar that came in and out. No more handwritten notes taped to the espresso machine. No more mystery cash that never reached the bank. My mom hated the idea of me being the one holding the numbers, but she hated the idea of foreclosure more. My dad signed because he thought it was temporary. Brianna signed because Mom told her to. I drove back to Seattle the next morning and started coding. For months, I split my life in half. By day, I worked on payment tools and risk models for my employer. At night, I built the Monroe Dashboard, a system that pulled live data from the registers in every shop, logged every transaction, and matched it against inventory and bank deposits. When it finally went live, I stood in the back of the flagship cafe with a laptop while my mom rang up a line of regulars. Each swipe of a card or tap of a phone popped up on my screen in real time, tiny proof that the bleeding could stop. We stabilized. Bills got paid. The scary letters slowed down. My parents kept the house in the suburbs. On paper, I saved the family business. In reality, I just postponed the inevitable and gave them a tool sharp enough to cut both ways. The strange thing was, nothing about how they treated me really changed. At a family barbecue to celebrate turning things around, my mom wrapped an arm around Brianna in front of a group of customers and said, "She is the heart of Monroe Roasters. We would be nothing without her." Then she nodded toward me, standing off to the side with my laptop, and added, "And Alexis does the computer stuff, whatever that is." People laughed politely. I smiled because I was used to it. I had been the kid in the back since I was 10, the one tinkering while my sister charmed the room. But now I was the kid in the back who owned most of the room and had a live feed of every sale running through it. For a while I told myself that was enough, that saving them once meant I had done my part. Then, on the night of January 1st, 2026, sitting alone in my Seattle apartment after walking out of that gift exchange, I opened the same dashboard I had built to rescue them and saw a pattern that did not make sense. The gross sales at each location were high, the bank deposits were strangely low, and the cash column looked like someone had been carving little pieces out of it for a long time. I scrolled back month after month, watching the gap widen, and realized my family had not just disrespected me. They had been using the system I created to quietly hide money, trusting that the girl who just did computer stuff would never say a word. At 8:30 on the morning of January 2nd, a plain brown box landed on my parents' front porch in Portland while I sat 200 miles away in my Seattle apartment, watching a progress bar crawl across my laptop screen. The night before, after I saw the cash gaps in the dashboard, I stayed up exporting everything I needed from the system I had built. Every cash sale, every card swipe, every deposit, every missing dollar, neatly organized into a file that told the truth more clearly than I ever could. I loaded that file and a lightweight offline version of my app onto a USB drive, printed out a few pages of summary reports, and tucked it all into that box along with a single sticky note that said, "Plug this in. No signature, no explanation, just numbers." A same-day courier picked it up from the front desk of my building and drove south, while I tried to decide whether I was being petty or finally honest. In their kitchen, my mom was probably topping off her mug, my dad scrolling through news on his phone, my sister checking comments on her holiday posts. When the doorbell rang, my niece Sadie ran to the window and shouted something about a package. My sister opened the door, looked around the empty porch, and carried the box inside like it was just another late gift. She tore off the tape, flipped the lid open, and froze. Inside was the USB, the printed reports with the Monroe Roasters logo at the top, and page after page of columns showing sales, deposits, and a growing column labeled underreported. I was not there to see it, but I know my sister well enough to picture her calling for our mom, her voice climbing a little higher with each word. My mom would have wiped her hands on a dish towel, annoyed at the interruption, until she saw my name in one of the tiny footers at the bottom of the report. Generated by Monroe Analytics, a Lex Monroe tool. That was the part I did on purpose. My dad would have taken the papers, flipped through them, and gone pale when he realized the dates went back years, long before that New Year's Day, where they decided I was not worth a $20 gift card. Somewhere amid the confusion, they would have seen the line that showed exactly how much money should have hit the bank and how much actually did. The difference was not a rounding error, it was a pattern. At some point, my mom must have grabbed her phone and tried to call me, because a notification popped up on my screen for half a second before it disappeared. Blocked. A second later, another call came through from my dad, also blocked. Then a text from my sister, "Are you serious right now?" Followed by three dots. Then nothing, because my phone filters messages from numbers I have muted into a quiet little folder I never check. While they crowded around the kitchen table with those pages and that USB, arguing about what could be proven and what could still be hidden, I opened the same reports on my laptop and scrolled slowly. I watched the numbers like I was watching an old wound finally being stitched closed. For years they had taken me for granted, told anyone who would listen that I was just the kid who played with computers while they did the real work. Now every corner they had cut and every dollar they had skimmed was laid out in a format designed to be understood by bankers, auditors, and tax agents. I still had not decided exactly who I was going to show it to when I hit save and closed my laptop. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity. For the first time in my life, my family needed something from me more than I needed anything from them. My sister showed up at my apartment in Seattle the next afternoon like nothing was wrong, like we were two normal siblings grabbing coffee after the holidays. I watched her through the peephole for a second, standing in the hallway in her expensive coat, phone in one hand, reusable cup in the other, looking more like an influencer on a brand deal than someone whose entire business had just been dissected on paper. When I opened the door, she smiled too wide and said, "Lex, can we talk?" And my first instinct was to shut it again. Instead, I stepped aside and let her walk in. She made a slow loop around my living room, pointing out the view, the framed hackathon badge, the second monitor on my desk, as if seeing evidence that my life was real for the first time. Then she put her cup down and dropped the act. "Mom is freaking out," she said. "Dad, too." Her voice had that tight edge she gets when she is scared but trying not to show it. "They found your name on the reports. They know it came from you." I leaned against the counter and waited. She kept talking, fast now. "We thought you just helped with the loans. Okay? We did not know you actually owned most of the company and had some back door into everything." "That is not how any of this works," I said. "You all sat at the table and signed the papers. You knew exactly what I was offering and what I was asking for." She waved that away, like it was a detail that did not matter. "They are saying this is going to cause a huge mess with taxes, that you blew it up over nothing. Over a rough holiday, Alexis." My chest tightened at that. Nothing. A rough holiday. I saw again my mom looking straight through me on New Year's Day, while everyone around me opened gifts, and I felt something settle into place. Brianna must have seen it on my face because she switched strategies. "Look," she said, dropping her voice. "You know how things are run. Cash is just easier sometimes. People have done it like this forever. And Sadie loves her school. She loves her friends. If this gets any worse, we could lose the house, the shops, everything. Do you really want to be the reason she has to pack up her room and say goodbye to her whole life?" I almost laughed because it was so textbook. When we were kids, Mom used to pull that same move, wrapping every argument in guilt and family and tradition until you could not tell where your feelings ended and hers began. I thought about Sadie with her messy ponytail and science kit, about how she had nothing to do with any of this, and for a second, I felt my resolve wobble. Then I remembered the numbers on my screen. Years of underreported cash, years of them signing my name as an officer on tax forms while quietly skimming from the business I had saved. "You are not putting this on a 9-year-old, I said quietly. "You and Mom and Dad made these choices, not her." She shook her head like I was being unreasonable. "You changed, Alexis. You left. You chose tech and strangers over your own family. And now you are punishing us for not throwing you a party every time you come home." There it was, the old script. I walked away from the only thing that mattered. I was ungrateful. I owed them loyalty forever because I shared their last name. I thought about a winter morning when I was 15, standing in the back of the original Monroe Roasters with a beat-up laptop balanced on a milk crate. I had stayed up all night teaching myself how to build a basic ordering page, proud of the little form that could send drink choices straight to the bar. When I showed it to my mom, she laughed gently and told me to put it away so I would not scare off the regulars. "People come here to talk to us, not to a screen," she said loud enough for the whole line to hear, then called Brianna out front and had her practice steaming milk and chatting with customers while I pretended I was busy with homework in the back. I did not know it then, but that day set the tone for the next decade. She was the face. I was the background. And now the background had receipts. Back in my apartment, I straightened up and looked my sister in the eye. "I am not doing this to you," I said. "I am done covering for decisions I did not make. If there is nothing to hide, then the numbers will match." "Right?" She opened her mouth, shut it again, and grabbed her cup. "This is not you," she muttered on her way to the door. "You used to be the one person I could count on to put family first." I let that sit in the air for a second before I answered. Maybe putting family first is what got me into this mess. After she left, the silence in my apartment felt heavier than it had the night before. I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and pulled up everything I had exported. The reports, the logs, the email chains where my parents casually referred to pulling a little extra cash this week. My name on the corporate documents that said I was responsible if things went wrong. I dialed the number of a business attorney in Seattle that one of my coworkers had recommended months earlier when we were joking about worst-case scenarios. This time, it was not a joke. I explained who I was, what I had built, what I had found. I asked her a question I had been avoiding since the moment I saw the first discrepancy. If I know there is tax fraud happening in a company where my name is on the paperwork and I stay quiet, does that make me complicit? She did not sugarcoat it. "It does not look good," she said. "And if it blows up later, they will absolutely try to throw you under the bus." She walked me through my options, including one I had heard of but never really thought about: the IRS whistleblower program. I spent the rest of the day reading everything I could find about it, cross-checking requirements with my data, making sure I did not cross any lines with privacy or hacking. I had admin access. I had built the system. I had every right to those reports. By the time the sun went down over Seattle again, I had written out a detailed statement, attached files, and filled in the online submission, not as a bitter daughter, but as a majority shareholder who no longer wanted her name attached to a lie. Hitting submit did not feel dramatic. There was no thunderclap, no swelling music. It just felt like finally stepping out of a burning house I had been told to pretend was fine. Maybe real family would have cared that I was the one suffocating inside it. Several months later, the first white envelope from the Internal Revenue Service showed up in my parents' mailbox, and everything that had been whispered around the kitchen table suddenly had an official letterhead. I did not see their faces when they opened it, but I heard about the panic secondhand from a cousin who worked part-time at one of the shops. He texted me that my mom had gone quiet in the middle of a rush, walked to the back room with the letter, and come out with eyes so red even the regulars noticed. The notice was not dramatic by itself. It was a standard audit letter, the kind that says the government would like to take a closer look at a few years of returns for a small business that, on paper, looks more profitable than what is flowing through its bank accounts. For a normal company, it would have been scary, but manageable. For Monroe Roasters, with its neatly hidden pile of missing cash and a majority shareholder who had just filed a whistleblower report, it was a slow fuse on a much bigger explosion. My parents did exactly what I expected. They hired a local tax attorney, printed out their own version of the numbers, and tried to build a story where the gaps in deposits were all just innocent oversights. There was talk of informal cash bonuses, tips handled off the books, little favors for employees that never made it into payroll. The plan, from what I could piece together, was simple. Blame bad record keeping, throw around enough emotional language about being a family business, and hope the IRS would be satisfied with a slap on the wrist. My name came up when the attorney asked who had designed their system. That was when the situation stopped being a private family mess and became something I could not ignore. An agent from the IRS called me at my Seattle number one morning while I was in between meetings for my fintech job. She introduced herself, confirmed my role as majority shareholder and system architect, and asked if I would be willing to answer some questions about how the Monroe Roasters point-of-sale system worked. I closed my office door, sat down, and told her yes. We scheduled a video conference. A week later, I found myself on a split screen with three people who had defined my entire childhood. My parents sat at the dining room table in Portland, my sister at their side, the same chandelier above them that had hung over every Christmas, every birthday, every big fight we had ever had. On the other side of the screen were the agent, her supervisor, and the tax attorney my parents had hired. I was in a plain conference room at my office, a glass wall behind me, my laptop pushed a little farther back than usual so I would not have to look too closely at my own reflection. The agent started with routine questions. How long had I been a shareholder? When did I implement the PO system? What access did I have to the data? I answered carefully but honestly. I explained that the registers in each shop send every transaction to a central database in real time, that each sale is logged with a timestamp, payment method, and amount, and that the system automatically generates daily reports comparing sales to deposits. When the attorney tried to jump in and suggest that maybe the sync sometimes failed or the logs were incomplete, I asked permission to share my screen and pulled up a sanitized version of the dashboard, using demo data to illustrate how it worked. I showed them the transaction trail, the reconciliation view, the error logs that would flag any failed sync. The agent watched quietly, making notes. My parents just stared, like they were seeing the thing I had built for the very first time. Once the basics were clear, the questions shifted. Had I ever discussed discrepancies between reported income and what the system showed? Had I ever been asked to alter numbers? I answered that I had noticed small red flags in earlier years and brought them up in vague terms, only to be brushed off with jokes about cash being hard to track. I said I had never changed the data myself, never edited logs or deleted transactions, and that the system was designed specifically to prevent silent changes without an audit trail. My mom chose that moment to break down. She wiped tears that did not smudge her makeup and said into the camera, "We are just a family trying to keep a small business alive. We are not some big corporation. Maybe we made mistakes, but we are not criminals." My dad chimed in about the pressure of keeping employees paid, about rising rent and supply costs, about how sometimes you take cash because you do not know when the next crisis is coming. My sister tried to pin the whole thing on me, choosing to build something too complicated, calling it a confusing app that none of them really understood. She implied that some of the discrepancies might be my fault, that I might have misconfigured something or misreported something to their accountant without explaining it properly. I sat there and let them talk until the attorney nodded in my direction, silently asking if I wanted to respond. I took a breath, kept my voice level, and said that the system does not misplace cash. People do. I pointed out that the underreported amounts were not random. They followed a consistent pattern that always benefited the same people. The agent asked if I could provide export files backing up my statement. I told her I already had and that she should find them attached to the whistleblower report submitted months earlier under my name. The silence after that was the longest I can remember between my parents and me. The attorney cleared his throat, realizing for the first time that I was not there to clean up their story, but to draw a line between myself and what they had done. The weeks that followed were a blur of paperwork and quiet, simmering tension. The IRS requested bank records, vendor invoices, and years of receipts. They cross-checked my exports against what had actually been deposited. Every time a gap appeared, another letter went out. Every time a letter went out, my parents called or texted until I blocked another number. While all of that was happening, my life in Seattle took a strange turn upward. My boss pulled me into a meeting and told me a paper I had co-written about small business fraud detection had been accepted at a fintech conference in San Francisco. They wanted me to present the case study I had anonymized based on the Monroe data, minus the family names and drama. I booked a flight, wrote a talk about how technology can protect owners and employees when used transparently, and tried not to think about the irony of using the fallout of my own family as a professional success story. On the day I stood on stage in a hotel ballroom explaining to a room full of founders how underreported cash can hide in plain sight, my phone buzzed with a voicemail from my cousin back in Portland. I did not listen to it until late that night, but when I did, his voice was shaking. The IRS had just finished a key meeting with my parents and their lawyer. The words fraud and penalties had been used in the same sentence more than once. It was no longer a question of whether something would happen, only of how hard the hammer would fall and how much of the damage they would try to pin on me when it did. By the time the hammer finally fell, it was late summer, the kind of sticky Portland heat that makes everything feel a little heavier than it is. I was at my desk in Seattle when the email came from the IRS agent. The audit was complete. The underreported cash was not a misunderstanding or a bookkeeping error. It was a pattern, and it was going to be treated like one. A few days later, my cousin sent me a photo of another thick envelope on my parents' kitchen table. Inside was the official determination: years of back taxes owed, civil penalties, interest that had been quietly growing while they pretended everything was fine. It was more than Monroe Roasters could absorb, even on a good year. And this was not a good year. Customers had been drifting away for months, spooked by rumors and awkward tension at the counter. My parents tried to keep it together at first. They called emergency family meetings, though I was never invited. They talked to banks about restructuring loans, to landlords about rent relief, to anyone who would listen about being unfairly targeted. None of it changed the math. Within weeks, the for sale signs started going up. First, it was the smallest shop, the cozy one near the university where I had done my homework as a kid. Then the flagship cafe downtown, the one my mom always called her second living room. They sold equipment at a discount, furniture for less than it was worth, anything to scrape together enough cash to keep the penalties from swallowing them whole. The house went next, the big craftsman in the suburbs that had hosted every Thanksgiving and birthday, the place I had driven away from on New Year's Day with a bag of untouched coffee in my hand. They packed decades of family photos into boxes and moved into a small rental apartment on the other side of town. Somewhere cheaper, somewhere no one would look at them like they used to. The fallout did not stop with money. My dad started seeing a cardiologist after his blood pressure spiked so high in one appointment, the nurse refused to let him leave without extra tests. My mom stopped posting cheerful updates from behind the counter because there was no counter left that belonged to her. The regulars she used to call by name drifted to other shops, and the women she once bragged with about her small business success stopped inviting her to their brunches. Brianna tried to ride out the storm online, pivoting her content away from the family brand to vague lifestyle posts, but sponsors quietly stepped back when they realized the charming coffee empire behind her was now a cautionary tale. The cracks in her marriage with Tyler, which had always been there under the surface, split open fast when the financial stress hit. He resented being dragged into a mess he had not created. She resented that he would not pretend it was all going to magically fix itself. Within a few months, they were separated, then divorced. Sadie went from a big bedroom in a nice school district to a smaller apartment and a different school where no one knew her last name. Somewhere in the middle of all that, my parents tried one last time to make me the villain. My phone lit up with a number I did not recognize one night. I answered without thinking and heard my mother before the connection even stabilized. "You did this," she said. Her voice was hoarse, like she had been crying for hours. "You tore this family apart over some numbers on a screen and a hurt feeling from a holiday. We lost everything because you could not let it go." I let her talk. I let my dad come on the line and say it too, in his quieter way, telling me about friends who no longer called, about employees who had moved on. At the end of his speech, he said, "You know, they never would have looked this hard if you had not pointed them in our direction. You turned your own parents in. That has to mean something to you." "It does," I said. "It means I am not willing to go down for choices I did not make. You signed my name on those returns. You used my system to hide cash and assumed I would stay quiet because we share DNA. That was your bet. You lost." There was more arguing, more guilt, more appeals to tradition and loyalty, but nothing they said changed the fact that the IRS had made its decision, and Monroe Roasters was gone. When the call finally dropped, I sat there staring at my reflection in the dark screen of my laptop and felt something I had not felt in years. Not triumph, not joy, just a clean, sharp kind of relief. I was out. Shortly after the last shop sold, I received the paperwork to finalize the transfer of my remaining shares to the buyer, a regional coffee group that had picked up the brand name and some of the locations. I signed everything electronically, watched my ownership shrink to zero, and saw the wire hit my account a few days later. It was not a fortune, not after the debts and penalties, but it was enough. Enough for a down payment on a small house near the river in Portland, a place with big windows and a spare room I could turn into an office. Enough to seed the savings I had started for myself after realizing that family was not a safety net I could count on. I moved back to Oregon on my own terms. Not to my parents' couch, not to the shadow of the old Monroe Roasters sign, but to a quiet street where no one knew me as the disappointment who left the family business. I brought my monitors, my worn-out hoodie, and the same laptop I had used to build the system that changed everything. I set up my desk facing the water and opened a blank document titled Next. Officially, I was still a senior engineer for my fintech company. Unofficially, I had started sketching out plans for my own product, a tool to help small business owners spot exactly the kind of fraud and sloppiness my parents had wrapped in the language of survival. There was a certain symmetry to that. They had used my skills to cheat the system. I was going to use the same skills to help other people keep their books clean. Months later, as fall crept back into the Pacific Northwest, I walked past one of the old Monroe locations on my way to meet a friend. The sign had been replaced, the menu redesigned, the baristas all new. No one recognized me. No one knew that my last name had once been painted on the windows. I stood there for a second, watching customers line up for their drinks, and felt a strange mix of grief and gratitude. The place that had defined my childhood was gone. The version of me that needed their approval had gone with it. The people who hurt me had paid a price I did not have to collect in person. I turned away and kept walking toward a life that finally felt like mine. The first morning, I woke up in my little house by the river in Portland. The light came in soft and gray through the blinds, and for a second I forgot everything that had happened. There was no smell of espresso beans roasting downstairs, no clatter of cups, no distant sound of my mother calling orders in that bright, performative voice she used for customers. Just quiet. My own coffee mug, my own kitchen, my own name on the lease. I made a pour over with beans from a local roaster that had nothing to do with my family, carried it into my office, and opened my laptop. The Monroe dashboard was gone from my bookmarks. In its place was a new project folder, the one I had started the night I signed my shares away. A tool for small business owners who wanted transparency instead of convenient blind spots. A system designed to protect decent people from the exact kind of shortcuts my parents had convinced themselves were normal. Building it was oddly healing. Every line of code felt like a tiny reversal of what had been done with the last system I built. Instead of hiding cash, this one highlighted risk patterns. Instead of making it easy for owners to skim off the top, it made it easy for employees to see when something did not add up. I went to local meetups, talked to other founders, listened to stories from baristas and bookkeepers who had watched bosses play games with numbers. I realized my family was not unique. The only thing unusual was that someone on the inside had both the skills and the willingness to say, "This is wrong, and I will not carry it for you." News about my parents and my sister trickled in slowly after that. I heard that my mom had taken a part-time job at a mid-sized cafe across town, working the early shift, clocking in and out like everyone else. She no longer posted about being the heart of any brand. She just poured drinks and wiped counters. My dad rented a small place in a complex near the freeway, somewhere cheap, somewhere anonymous. He went to doctor appointments, took medication, spent a lot of time watching sports with the volume too loud. The friends who used to come over for barbecues did not visit the apartment. They sent the occasional text and then stopped. Brianna bounced between content gigs, trying to rebuild her online persona without the Monroe Roasters backdrop. She still smiled into the camera, still talked about cozy mornings and grind culture, but the comment sections were quieter. The glossy narrative of a thriving family business had cracked, and there was no app filter that could fix it. Sadie started at a new school in a different district. I saw a photo once in a message someone forwarded by accident, her backpack almost as big as she was, her hand in her mother's, her face turned slightly away from the camera. She looked small and braver than she should have to be. That night, I opened a separate account in her name, one she does not know exists yet, and automated a transfer from every paycheck. It is not some grand gesture. It is just a promise to myself that if she ever decides she wants education or a way out, or simply a choice that is not wrapped in guilt and obligation, there will be something waiting for her that is not tied to anyone's secrets. People sometimes ask me if I regret what I did. They almost always phrase it the same way. Was it worth it? Did it feel good to watch them lose everything? The honest answer is complicated. It did not feel good to watch my parents' faces crumble on a grainy video call, or to hear the strain in my sister's voice when she realized there was no easy way out. It did not feel good to know a 9-year-old had to pack up her room because the adults in her life chose shortcuts over integrity. What did feel good was stepping out of a role I was never meant to play. I grew up thinking I had to absorb every bad decision, patch every hole, and silently carry the weight of choices I did not make, because that was what family meant. It took an audit and an investigation with my name on the paperwork to understand that family without respect is just shared history. What I did was not about revenge in the cartoon sense. I did not slash tires or scream in parking lots or try to ruin anyone's life on purpose. I told the truth to the only people who could do something about it and refused to lie just because we share a last name. That was my revenge. I chose myself. I chose not to be the quiet, convenient scapegoat one more time. If there is a lesson in all of this, it is not that you should turn your parents in at the first sign of trouble. It is that loving someone does not mean helping them bury the damage they cause. It is that your skills, even the ones your family rolls their eyes at, have value far beyond their approval. And it is that protecting your own future is not betrayal when the alternative is letting someone else drag you under with them. These days, my life is small in a way that feels peaceful. I write code. I walk by the river. I grab coffee with friends who see me as a person, not as a problem to fix or a resource to exploit. Sometimes I still pass one of the old Monroe locations and feel a pang, a flash of grief for what might have been if my family had chosen honesty. But the feeling passes. The relief stays. I did not ruin their lives. I just stopped helping them hide the way they were ruining their own. If you have ever been the odd one out in your family, the disappointing child, the one they only call when something needs fixing, I hope my story reminds you that you are allowed to draw a line. You are allowed to say no. You are allowed to choose a life where you are not constantly paying the interest on someone else's mistakes. And if you were in my place with your name on those documents and your work twisted into a weapon, what would you have done? Would you have stayed quiet to keep the peace, or would you have walked away the way I did? Tell me in the comments, and remember, the first person you owe loyalty to is the one you have to live with every day yourself.